Okay, so right now this dropdown looks great and everything is sort of where it's supposed to be, but when we actually click the avatar, the dropdown doesn't open or close. It's just permanently open. So in this lesson, let's walk through using a little bit of Tailwind and a little bit of Vue to actually make this dropdown work the way that you'd expect. So the first thing that I'm going to do is add a little bit of state to keep track of whether or not this dropdown should be open. So we're just going to add an isOpen property, and why don't we set it to false by default. Next, let's hide the actual dropdown area whenever isOpen is not set to true. So I'm just going to add a vif here and have this set to isOpen. So whenever isOpen is true, this is going to be displayed. Whenever isOpen is false, it's not going to be displayed. So now you can see the dropdown did actually vanish, and if we were to switch this to true, it should default to being open. So we do want it closed by default, so let's switch this back to false. And next, let's make it open when we click the button. So I'm going to add a click handler to the button. So we'll just say add click, and then we'll just say isOpen is equal to not isOpen. So we'll have this button toggle that anytime that you click it. So now we should have this sort of working. So if we click this, it opens, and if we click it again, it closes. So we're off to a good start here. Now, the next thing that you probably want to happen with a dropdown like this is you want to be able to click outside of the dropdown and have the dropdown actually close. Right now, if we click outside, nothing happens. We can just like select text and stuff like that, but the dropdown stays open. Now, there are a couple different ways we could solve this problem. One of them is a lot more JavaScript heavy than the others. So I'm going to focus on an approach that's a little simpler and relies more on working with the DOM and CSS and stuff like that. So what we want to happen, right, is we want to be able to click outside of this dropdown and have this close. So we need some sort of click handler on some element to trigger closing the dropdown. So what if we added an element that filled the entire screen but sat behind this dropdown? So whenever you clicked outside of the dropdown, you were clicking this sort of like full screen overlay that closed the element. I'll show you kind of what I mean. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just adding a button. Now, because we want this to be clickable, the semantically correct thing to do here is use a button element, not just a div with a click handler or anything like that. So I'm going to add a button. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a click handler to this button that says whenever you click this, isOpen is going to be set to false. We don't want it to toggle, we just want it to close. Okay, so now you can see that we do have, something happening that's affecting the layout here. So let's use some Tailwind utilities to sort of make this button act as like sort of a full screen overlay. So to start, let's just add a class attribute here. And you might think to start by adding a position absolute, right? So that we can position this element sort of wherever we want. Now we could do something like top 0, right 0, bottom 0, left 0, and you think, okay, maybe this is going to cover the entire screen now. Let's give this a background color like BG red 500 or something so we can see it. And you can see it's still actually not showing up. So in this case, let's also add a height of full and a width of full and see if that works. Okay, so now we do have this square showing up. Now, the thing that you might be surprised by at first is that this button is only covering the space taken up by the avatar. It's not sort of filling the whole screen. And this comes back to what we talked about before, where because we have added position relative to this div, it's sort of acting as a position reference. So any elements nested inside that have position absolute are going to be positioned relative to the nearest positioned ancestor. So if we want to completely sort of break out of this container, we can use position fixed, which makes it always relative to the viewport. So now you can see we have this giant red square that covers the entire screen. Now, we don't want this always visible, right? We only want this visible when the dropdown is open. So just like this div, we can add a vif to this as well. And we can say vif is open, show this square, otherwise don't. Now, if we go ahead and click this button, we should see that big red rectangle show up again, and it does. And if we click the red rectangle, it closes. Now, we don't actually want this to be this ugly red rectangle, of course, because that's not what you'd want a real UI to look like. But maybe just so we can sort of see the effect of what we're doing here, let's keep a little bit of a color. So why don't we do something like maybe BG black, but give it an opacity of, say, 50, see what that looks like. At 50%. So if we click this button, yeah, now everything kind of dims except the dropdown. You may like this effect, you may not like this effect. We could, of course, make this totally transparent, but I think for the purposes of sort of understanding what we're doing in this lesson, it's kind of nice to have some sort of visual representation of this area. So I'm going to keep it this color. Now, one thing you might be noticing is that we're getting like a pointer cursor when we hover over the background, which may be a little bit unexpected. So I'm going to switch this to cursor default instead of the pointer cursor. And that way it doesn't actually look like you're trying to click on a button, even though that's how it's implemented. So now you see we do just get the regular cursor, but we do get like the pointer cursor on the links and stuff like that, which I think is more like how you'd expect this to behave. But you might notice that when we hover over the avatar button, we still have the default cursor now, not the pointer cursor like you might expect. And that's because this full screen overlay is actually covering that avatar. Now, maybe this is fine, maybe you don't care, but if you did want this button to sort of pop through and be part of this layer, we can do that using ZIndex utilities. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to head over to the actual button with the avatar in it. And to start, I'm just going to try adding a ZIndex, anything above 0. The first step in Tailwind by default is Z10. So if we save this, you might expect that now, okay, this does show up on top of the background, but you'll see that it doesn't. And the reason for that is that you can't apply a ZIndex to any element that has position of static, which is the default position of elements in the browser. So if we wanted the ZIndex to actually work here, we're going to need to change the position to something else. Now, the best option for us in this case is relative, because that means the element is still kind of rendered exactly as it would be if it was positioned static, but now it's actually allowed to be affected by ZIndex. So you can see that when I saved, this button did pop up and appear on top of the background. So now if I click this, you can see the button is still there, and when I hover the mouse over it, the cursor does change to the pointer cursor. Okay, another little detail that might be worth fixing here is because we've implemented this background as a button, that means that we can tab to it. So you can't really see this, but when I hit Shift Tab in this case to tab back, right now the button actually has focus, even though that's not visible in any way. So that means I can hit space and close it, which is kind of weird, not really the behavior you'd expect. I think I'd like to be able to tab from this button directly to one of those links, not have a step in between. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a tab index of -1 to this button so that it's inaccessible from the keyboard. And now if we were to go ahead and open this dropdown, when I hit tab, it goes directly to the link and directly back to the button. So we sort of skip that background section. Now, one final piece of little cleanup that I'd like to do related to these classes. You remember here I introduced this top 0, right 0, bottom 0, left 0. This can be a little cumbersome to type out all 4 of these utilities when really you just want to set all of the sides to 0. So Tailwind has a shorthand for this using the Inset utility, and this is based on an upcoming feature of CSS where they're going to be adding a native inset property that works as a shorthand for these 4 properties. So we can just say inset 0, and then we don't need any of this stuff, and this just does the exact same thing. So you'll still see that when I click this button, we get that full screen overlay. Now, just like margins and paddings and stuff in Tailwind, if you only wanted to do this in one direction, you could do inset x0 or inset y0, which again is just sort of a long form for inset 0, but this is the left and right directions, and this is the top and bottom directions. Now in our case, again, just inset 0 is totally fine, so I'm just going to switch it back to that. Now, one final thing in terms of the behavior of this component, you might have been saying to yourself after we made this button not keyboard accessible by adding this tab index, you might have been thinking, whoa, 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 we need to be able to close this thing with the keyboard somehow. That's inaccessible, and that's true. So we should add a way to make it possible to close this dropdown from the keyboard. Now, I think the most conventional way to do that, though, is by hitting the escape key, not by like tabbing to some invisible button in the background and hitting space. So this is not Tailwind related at all. This is just going to be like a totally JavaScript view thing, but I thought just for completionist's sake, I'll add this in here for anyone that's interested. So let's quickly walk through how to set this up so that when we hit escape, this will actually close. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a created hook to the view component. And in here, we're going to create an event listener function that's going to handle any escape key presses. So I'm going to call this handle escape, and it's going to receive a keyboard event. And then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check if the key that was pressed is the escape key, or now to support other browsers, we also have to check if it could be actually the full word escape, not just ESC. If it's either of those, then we want to say is open should be false. So anytime you hit the escape key, we're going to close this dropdown. Now, all we need to do is actually add this event listener to the window. So I'm going to say documents.add event listener. Now we're going to listen for the key down event, and we're going to add our handle escape listener. And then to make sure that we clean up after ourselves, I'm going to listen for views destroyed hook or the before destroy hook. Doesn't really matter in this case. And then I'm just going to make sure that whenever this component is sort of torn down, that we remove the event listener. So I'm going to say remove event listener, key down, and we're going to remove that same event listener. So again, really simple. All we're doing is adding an event listener to the document. Anytime a key is pressed, we're going to run this function. If it's the escape key, we're going to make sure to close the dropdown, and we're going to make sure to remove that event listener to prevent any memory leaks or anything anytime this component is destroyed. So now with any luck, if we open this, I should be able to hit escape on the keyboard, and yep, it closes.